The air in room 7 of the Georgia Peach Inn was a thick, stagnant cocktail of stale cigarette smoke, cheap pine-scented cleaner, and the faint, sweet odor of decay. It was the smell of forgotten places and forgotten people. For Detective Ava Harding, it was just another Tuesday. At 52, with the silver in her tightly coiled hair outnumbering the black, she'd breathed this air in 100 different rooms across Atlanta. It no longer fazed her. Her partner, Detective Ben Carter, a decade and a half her junior, was less accustomed. He stood by the doorway, his crisp shirt already looking wilted in the oppressive June humidity that seeped through the motel's rattling air conditioning unit. "Looks like another one for the books, Ava," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the figure on the bed. "The ME is going to call this an OD before he even zips the bag." Ava didn't respond. She moved deeper into the room, her eyes doing the slow, methodical sweep that had become second nature over 30 years on the force. The victim, a man later identified as Silas Vance, 32, lay on his side, his face a pale, waxy mask. Beside the bed, on a particle board nightstand, was the classic tableau of a lonely end. A syringe, a spoon blackened with soot, and a small torn baggie with a dusting of white powder. Everything was exactly as it should be for a fatal overdose. And that was precisely what bothered her. It was too neat, too composed. Addicts in the final, desperate throes of their craving were rarely so tidy. They were frantic, messy. Here, there were no overturned lamps, no scattered belongings. The victim's wallet was still in his back pocket, a thick wedge of cash inside. A pricey-looking Swiss watch was still clasped around his wrist. His phone was on the nightstand, plugged into the wall, as if he'd just been charging it for the morning. Ben, following procedure, began cataloging the scene. No signs of forced entry. Room was paid for in cash, no reservation. The maid found him when he didn't answer for checkout. He looked at Ava, expecting her usual nod of agreement, the one that said, "Wrap it up, let's go." Instead, he saw the faint furrow in her brow, the slight narrowing of her eyes that he'd learned meant she was seeing something he wasn't. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know," Ava said, her voice a low murmur. She knelt, her gaze fixed not on the body, but on the worn, faded carpet. "It just feels quiet. Too quiet." She wasn't a woman who relied on nebulous gut feelings, but she trusted the dissonant notes that a crime scene played in her head. This one was playing a silent tune. The medical examiner arrived, a portly man named Dr. Evans, who confirmed their initial assessment with a weary sigh. "Heroin overdose. Fentanyl-laced, probably. I see 3 of these a week. I'll run the tox screen, but I can already tell you the result." He performed his preliminary examination, noting the needle mark on the victim's arm, the cyanosis of his lips. Everything pointed to the same, sad, simple conclusion. An hour later, the body was gone, the room was sealed, and Ava and Ben were back in their unmarked sedan. The city's afternoon traffic was already building into a roaring, angry beast. "So, accidental death?" Ben asked, tapping his notes into the department-issued tablet. Ava stared out the window, watching the blur of the city pass by. She should have said yes. All the evidence, every single piece of it, pointed to that conclusion. It was a clean-cut case, an open and shut tragedy that would barely make a ripple in the city's crime statistics. Closing it would be easy, it would be logical. But the image of that tidy nightstand, of the watch on the dead man's wrist, lingered in her mind like a phantom limb. It was a detail that had no place in the story everyone else was reading. "For now," she finally said, her voice flat, "write it up as a suspected overdose, pending toxicology, accidental." Ben nodded, satisfied. He started typing. As they drove back to the precinct, Ava felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. It was the weight of a loose thread, a tiny inconsistency that most would ignore. But she knew from long, bitter experience that it was the loose threads, the ones everyone else walked past, that could unravel everything. The file would be stamped. The case would be closed. But for Ava Harding, the silence in that motel room was deafening, and she had a sinking feeling she hadn't heard the last of Silas Vance. A week passed, the Atlanta summer settled in, a suffocating blanket of heat and humidity that made the air feel thick enough to drink. The case of Silas Vance was buried under an avalanche of new, more urgent files. A liquor store robbery in Buckhead, a domestic dispute turned violent in Grant Park, A string of carjackings on the connector. The toxicology report came back as expected. A lethal dose of fentanyl-laced heroin. The file was officially stamped, closed, accidental death, and relegated to a digital folder in the department's archives. For everyone but Ava Harding, Silas Vance had ceased to exist. Ava tried to let it go. She was 2 years from retirement, a prospect that felt both like a finish line and a cliff's edge. She had a small garden she wanted to tend to, a stack of unread novels, and a desire for mornings that didn't start with the scent of stale coffee and grim statistics. She told herself the nagging feeling about the Vance case was just the burnout talking, the old cop's paranoia of missing one last thing before hanging it up. Then, on a sweltering Thursday afternoon, a call came through to the precinct's non-emergency line. It was transferred to the homicide division, and by some fluke of scheduling, it landed on Ben Carter's desk. He listened for a few minutes, his expression shifting from boredom to mild interest, then to sharp attention. He put the caller on hold and walked over to Ava's desk. "You're not going to believe this," he said, leaning in. "Remember the motel OD, Silas Vance?" Ava looked up from her paperwork, her focus immediate. "What about him?" "I've got a guy on the line, a tourist. Name's David Miller. He and his wife were staying at the Georgia Peach Inn the same night Vance died. They were in the room next door, room 8. And," Ava pressed, her posture straightening, "they checked out at 5 in the morning to catch a flight back to Ohio. They never saw the police tape, never knew what happened. He said they just saw a small news brief online about a death at the motel, and it jogged his wife's memory. He says they heard something that night." Ava stood up. "Put him on speaker." Ben toggled a button on his desk phone, and a tinny, nervous voice filled the small space around them. "So, like I was saying, my wife, she's a light sleeper," David Miller explained. "It was late, maybe 1 in the morning. She woke me up, said she heard yelling from the next room." "Yelling?" Ava asked, her voice calm and steady, careful not to spook him. "Can you describe it, Mr. Miller?" "It wasn't long," the man said. "Just a short, angry burst. One voice was kind of high, frantic. The other was deeper, lower, very controlled, very cold. I heard the frantic one say something like, 'You can't do this to me. I'll tell everyone.'" Ava's heart began a slow, heavy beat. "And the other voice, the lower one?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's the part that stuck with my wife. All he said was one phrase, but he said it with this intensity. It was quiet, but it cut right through the wall. He just said, 'Shut up.' That's it. Then, nothing. A dead silence. We figured they worked it out and went back to sleep." A dead silence. The same silence Ava had felt in that room. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of sleep. It was the heavy, absolute quiet of something being finished. "Mr. Miller, this is very important. Did you hear anything else? A door opening or closing? Footsteps?" "No, ma'am, nothing at all. It was just over." Ava thanked him, took down his contact information, and assured him they would be in touch. After Ben disconnected the call, the office air hummed with a new energy. What had been a closed case, a simple tragedy, had just been cracked wide open by a chance memory from a tourist hundreds of miles away. Ben looked at Ava, a newfound respect in his eyes. "Your gut was right." Ava didn't acknowledge the compliment. She was already moving toward the records room, her mind racing. The tidy scene, the expensive watch, the controlled anger in a stranger's voice. These weren't the elements of an accidental overdose. They were the elements of a confrontation that ended with one man dead and another walking away into the night, leaving behind a perfectly staged scene. She found the digital file, her fingers clicking on the keyboard with renewed purpose. The image of Silas Vance's pale face flashed on the screen. "Pull everything we have on Vance," she said to Ben, her voice hard as steel. "His financials, his associates, his known enemies, everything. That man didn't die alone in that room. He had a visitor." She stared at the case file, the bright red closed stamp, now seeming like a mockery. She clicked a button and the status changed to Open Homicide Investigation. The silence had been broken. Now the hunt could begin. Reopening a cold case, even one that was only a week old, felt like trying to unring a bell. The crime scene tape was long gone. The the room at the Georgia Peach Inn had been cleaned and rented out half a dozen times, and any potential physical evidence had been bleached into oblivion. All they had was the echo of an argument and a dead man who, they now knew, wasn't alone when he died. Ava Harding knew that when the physical trail went cold, you had to search for the psychological one. If you're a man of means and you're going to a place like this to confront a blackmailer, she theorized to Ben as they drove back to the motel, you're not parking your Mercedes out front. You're finding a dark corner. You're waiting. You're nervous. They didn't go inside the motel. Instead, they walked the perimeter of the property, their eyes scanning the neglected corners and overgrown patches of grass. The back of the motel was a desolate landscape of overflowing dumpsters and a crumbling chain-link fence. It was the perfect place to be unseen. If I were him, Ava said, her gaze sweeping over the area, I'd park back here, away from the streetlights, hidden by the dumpsters. They began a slow, meticulous search of the gravelly patch of dirt behind the dumpsters. It was a tedious process, picking through discarded fast food wrappers and broken beer bottles. Ben was starting to think it was a waste of time when Ava suddenly stopped. Ben, your light? He shone his powerful flashlight where she was pointing. There, nestled amongst the weeds and gravel, were 3 small white objects. Cigarette butts. He knelt for a closer look. They weren't crushed-out Marlboros or Newports. They were sleek and black, with a refined silver band at the filter. Sherman's Blacks, Ben said, recognizing the brand. My grandfather used to smoke these. Said they were for people with more money than sense. You don't find these just lying around, especially not here. Ava put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully picked one up with a pair of tweezers, dropping it into an evidence bag. She examined it closely through the clear plastic. Look at the ends, she said. Ben leaned in. 2 of the cigarette butts had been extinguished neatly, pressed out with a careful thumb. But the third one was different. It was mangled, crushed with a violent twisting motion, as if someone had ground it into the dirt with the heel of their shoe. They both knew that after a week of Atlanta's unpredictable summer showers and humidity, the chances of pulling usable DNA from the paper were next to zero. But the cigarettes weren't about DNA anymore. They were a story told in tobacco and paper. He was waiting, Ava murmured, thinking aloud. He got here early. He was anxious, smoking one after another to calm his nerves. She pointed to the 2 neatly extinguished butts. But something changed. Maybe he got the call to come in. Maybe his anger or fear boiled over. She held up the bag with the crushed butt. This is what he felt right before he went inside that room. This is rage, or panic. This was their first tangible link to the phantom visitor. It wasn't a fingerprint or a strand of hair, but it was something just as valuable. A behavioral profile. They were looking for a person of means, someone with expensive tastes. They were looking for a smoker, and they were looking for someone who, on that particular night, was a bundle of raw, volatile nerves. Back at the precinct, Ava pinned the evidence bag containing the 3 cigarette butts to the large corkboard they had dedicated to the Vance case. They stared out from the bag, 3 silent witnesses. Okay, Ava said, turning to her team. We're no longer just looking into Vance's past. We're looking for a specific type of person connected to him. Someone with money, someone who smokes a niche, high-end brand of cigarette. Start digging. I want to know every wealthy individual Vance might have had contact with. Business associates, old schoolmates, anyone. The investigation now had a direction. It was a faint one, a trail of smoke in the wind, but it was more than they'd had that morning. The cigarettes had given their ghost a habit, a status, and a state of mind. They hadn't just found trash behind a dumpster. They had found the first faint traces of a man's anxiety, an anxiety that had ended in a silent motel room with a needle and a lie. The killer had been careful, meticulous even, in staging the scene of the crime, but he had been careless in staging the scene of his own fear. The name Julian Croft first surfaced from the murky depths of Silas Vance's life like a bad penny. While Vance's official record was a patchwork of petty fraud and con artistry, his unofficial life, pieced together from interviews with former associates, was far more ambitious. Vance was a bottom feeder, but he swam in deep waters. He made it his business to know the secrets of Atlanta's elite. Multiple sources say Vance was obsessed with the art scene, Ben reported to Ava, scrolling through his digital notes. Specifically with Croft's Gallery in the West Side Arts District. He was seen hanging around there a lot over the last few months. Apparently, he tried to get into a few of their exclusive parties, but was always turned away at the door. Croft Galleries was a temple of modern art, a sleek minimalist space where Atlanta's old money and new tech wealth mingled over glasses of champagne and seven-figure paintings. It was the absolute antithesis of the Georgia Peach Inn. Julian Croft himself was a pillar of the city's cultural scene, a handsome, sophisticated man in his mid-40s, known for his sharp suits and even sharper eye for talent. A man like Croft wouldn't give a guy like Vance the time of day, Ben mused. What was Vance's angle? Blackmailers don't target institutions, they target people, Ava said. Vance wasn't interested in the gallery, he was interested in someone at the gallery. They drove over to the west side. The air here smelled of money, a crisp, clean scent of new construction and expensive perfume. They found Julian Croft in his private office, a glass-walled cube overlooking the main gallery floor. He greeted them with a cool, practiced poise, gesturing for them to sit in chairs that were likely worth more than Ben's car. "Detectives," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "How can I help the APD?" "We're investigating the death of a man named Silas Vance," Ava began, watching him closely. "We have reason to believe he frequented the area around your gallery." A flicker of annoyance, quickly suppressed, crossed Croft's face. "Ah, yes, that unpleasant little man. My security staff had to remove him on a couple of occasions. He was a nuisance." Croft's dismissal was total, an effortless swatting away of a fly. He projected an aura of untouchable class. "Did you have any personal dealings with him?" Ben asked. "Personal dealings?" Croft laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Detective, look around you. My life is curated. I don't have personal dealings with gutter rats. He was simply another of the city's unfortunate souls, and I wish him no ill will, but his life had nothing to do with mine." The interview was a dead end. Croft was a polished wall of denial, his answers smooth, plausible, and utterly unhelpful. They thanked him for his time and stood to leave. As they walked out of the gallery and into the meticulously landscaped courtyard, Ava's eyes were drawn to a designated smoking area off to the side. It was elegant, of course, with a single sculptural crystal ashtray on a marble pedestal. Ava paused. Ben followed her gaze. There, sitting amongst a few other discarded cigarettes in the pristine ashtray, was a single, unmistakable black cigarette with a silver band. A Sherman's Black. A jolt went through Ava. It could be a coincidence. The gallery had hundreds of wealthy patrons. Any one of them could have smoked it. A good defense attorney would tear that connection to shreds. But a good detective didn't believe in coincidences of this magnitude. "Ben," she said quietly, her voice tight. "Let's go." Back in the car, the silence was thick with unspoken possibilities. "It doesn't have to be Croft," Ben said, thinking out loud. "He has a lot of high-profile friends, clients." "Exactly," Ava agreed. Croft might not have been the target. He might have been the gatekeeper. Vance wasn't trying to get to Croft. He was trying to get to someone Croft protects. They now had a new mission. It wasn't just about finding a smoker with expensive taste anymore. It was about unraveling the curated, protected world of Julian Croft, and finding out who, in his orbit of power and influence, had a secret so damaging they would meet a blackmailer in a rundown motel. They started by pulling a list of the gallery's major donors, its board members, and Croft's known close associates. The list was a who's who of Atlanta's powerful. But Ava had a hunch. This felt personal. She asked Ben to focus on one name in particular, the one person who appeared in countless society photos next to Julian Croft, their relationship described in magazine articles as a deep and abiding friendship. Ben typed the name into the search engine, along with a few keywords. He clicked through images, articles, and public records. After a few minutes, he stopped. He turned his laptop screen toward Ava. On the screen was a glossy photo from an Atlanta magazine profile published 2 years ago. The photo was of a man sitting in his stately, book-lined chambers, looking every bit the part of a powerful, respected figure. And there, on the corner of his polished mahogany desk, placed next to a stack of legal briefs, was an open, unmistakable pack of Sherman's Black cigarettes. The man in the photo was Judge Marcus Thorne. Judge Marcus Thorne was more than a man. He was an institution. In a city still wrestling with the ghosts of its racial past, He was a living symbol of progress. A black man raised in the working-class neighborhoods of Southwest Atlanta, who had ascended to one of the highest seats of judicial power in the federal system. His reputation was forged in steel. He was tough but fair, brilliant, and considered utterly incorruptible. He was the man the system pointed to as proof that it worked. Right now, that system was testing him. Judge Thorne was presiding over the most racially charged case the city had seen in a decade, the trial of a white police officer accused of shooting an unarmed black teenager. The courthouse was a pressure cooker, with protesters on the steps, media trucks lining the street, and the palpable tension of a city holding its breath. Every ruling Thorne made was dissected, every word he spoke analyzed for bias. He was walking a tightrope over a canyon of fire, and he was doing it with a serene, unshakable composure that awed even his detractors. This was the man Ava and Ben were now investigating for a sordid murder in a roach-infested motel. The disconnect was staggering. "It makes no sense, Ava," Ben said, staring at the judge's official portrait on his screen. "Why would a man like this, with everything to lose, get mixed up with a lowlife like Vance? And why would he be so careless as to leave a trail?" "Pressure," Ava answered, her voice low. She was looking at the same portrait, but she saw something different. She saw the immense weight behind the calm eyes, the burden of being a symbol. "Everyone has a breaking point, Ben. The brighter the light, the darker the shadow." Their next step was a delicate one. They couldn't issue a warrant or subpoena a federal judge based on a photo and a hunch. It would be professional suicide and could be seen as an attempt to intimidate a judge during a high-profile case, a political firestorm they couldn't afford. They had to be smarter. Ben spent the next day doing what he did best, digging in the digital world. He wasn't looking for a smoking gun, but for a thread, any thread, that connected the judge's curated life to the grimy world of Silas Vance. He cross-referenced phone records, not the judge's, but those of known associates of Vance. He scanned social media, looking for any link, no matter how tenuous. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Ben found a series of angry posts on an old, obscure message board for victims of scams. A user, anonymous of course, detailed how Silas Vance had blackmailed him. The user didn't give his name, but he gave details about losing a prestigious job, about a secret that would have ruined his family. At the end of his rant, he wrote, "I tried to get help. I even reached out to an old acquaintance of my father's, a man who became a big-shot judge. He wouldn't even see me, said he couldn't get involved, some justice." The post was 3 years old. "A long shot, I know," Ben said, showing it to Ava. "But big-shot judge and old acquaintance of my father's, it's a place to start." Ava's mind went to work. If Vance's father knew a judge, there would be a record somewhere. She put in a request for old court dockets, property deeds, any public document that might link the two families. It was like looking for a specific needle in a continent of haystacks. But a junior clerk in the records department, bored and meticulous, found it. 25 years ago, in a minor civil dispute over a fence line, the attorney representing the Vance family was a young, ambitious lawyer fresh out of Emory Law School. His name was Marcus Thorne. The connection wasn't just a random theory anymore. It was real, it was old, and it was personal. Judge Thorne hadn't just met Vance. He had a history with his family. He had known who Silas Vance was long before he became a problem. Ava stood up and put on her jacket. The time for indirect investigation was over. "Let's go see the judge," she said. Ben looked up, a mix of apprehension and excitement on his face. "What are we going to say?" "We're going to tell him we're investigating the death of Silas Vance," Ava replied, her expression unreadable. "And then we're going to watch his face. A man like that is used to being in control, to reading other people. Let's see how he does when the tables are turned." They were no longer just investigating a murder. They were about to knock on the door of a fortress, and they had no idea if the man inside was a victim or a monster. The chambers of a federal judge are designed to project power. The walls of Judge Marcus Thorne's office were lined with dark mahogany bookshelves, filled with leather-bound legal volumes. An American flag stood in one corner, the Georgia state flag in the other. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and lemon polish. It was a world away from the Georgia Peach Inn. Judge Thorne received them with a guarded but polite professionalism. He sat behind his immense desk, his hands steepled. the very picture of judicial authority. He was wearing his black robe, having just come from a morning session in court. "Detectives," he said, his voice a rich, measured baritone. "My clerk said this was an urgent matter. I trust it is, given the trial I'm currently overseeing." "It is, Your Honor," Ava began, taking the lead. "We're investigating the death of a man named Silas Vance. We believe you may have known him." There it was, a flicker, so small and so fast that if Ava hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional pause before he spoke. It was the tell of a man whose mind was racing, calculating. "Vance," Thorne said, letting the name hang in the air as if searching his memory. "Yes, the name is vaguely familiar. A troubled young man, if I recall. I believe I represented his father in a small matter many, many years ago, when I was in private practice. A tragedy, his death, I'm sure." His performance was flawless. He acknowledged the connection, but framed it as distant and ancient, deflating its importance before they could even inflate it. "He reached out to you recently, didn't he?" Ben pressed, a bit more aggressively than Ava would have liked. Thorne's gaze shifted to Ben, and it was like being hit with a blast of Arctic air. "Detective, I am a federal judge in a city of millions. Countless people reach out to my office for various reasons. I don't handle my own scheduling. Now, if that's all..." He made a subtle gesture toward the door. "We have reason to believe you were the last person he tried to contact before he died," Ava interjected smoothly, pulling the focus back. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening into a mask of indignation. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with the death of this individual and known drug addict? Detectives, I am in the middle of the most sensitive trial of my career, a trial with profound racial implications. The timing of this inquiry is highly suspect. I would advise you to be very, very careful about the accusations you levy." It was a masterful deflection, wrapping himself in the flag of his high-stakes trial, painting them as reckless cops who might be jeopardizing justice, or worse, as pawns in a racist game to undermine him. He was using his power, his very identity as a black man in a position of authority, as a shield. They left his chambers with nothing. He had admitted nothing, denied everything, and implicitly threatened their careers. Their next stop was Julian Croft. If Thorne had an alibi, it would come from him. They found him at the gallery, and this time, his cool demeanor was replaced with a fierce, protective anger. "You went to see Marcus?" he demanded before they could even ask a question. "Are you insane? Do you have any idea the pressure he's under? This is a witch hunt." "We're just doing our job, Mr. Croft," Ava said calmly. "Where was Judge Thorne on the night of Tuesday, June 14th? Julian didn't hesitate. "He was with me, right here. We were here until well after midnight, planning the details for the museum's annual fundraising gala. He's the honorary chair this year." He crossed his arms, his jaw set. "We were in my office, then we walked the gallery floor, deciding where to place the installations. My security chief saw him leave. Several members of my late-night staff saw him here. He has a rock-solid alibi. It was perfect, too perfect. A powerful man's alibi, supplied by his equally powerful best friend and corroborated by loyal employees. It was a fortress. They walked away, defeated for the moment. The fortress seemed impenetrable. "They're lying," Ben said, frustration evident in his voice as they got back to the car. "I know they are, but how do we prove it?" Ava was silent for a long moment, replaying the two interviews in her head. Thorne's calculated indignation, Croft's passionate defense. It was a well-rehearsed performance, but even the best actors can miss a cue. She remembered the split second of hesitation in Thorne's eyes. He had been prepared for them to ask if he knew Vance. He had not been prepared for them to ask about recent contact. That was the crack in the wall. "People like them think they can control everything," Ava said softly, more to herself than to Ben. "The narrative, the witnesses, the evidence, they build a fortress of lies." She started the car, a new resolve hardening her features. "But they always forget one thing." "What's that?" Ben asked. "They forget we can see the world outside their walls. They can control their employees. They can't control every traffic camera, every security feed, every digital footprint in a 2-mile radius of that motel." She pulled out into traffic, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Let's go see what the world outside their fortress has to say. The Fortress of Lies, built by Judge Thorne and Julian Croft, was formidable. It was constructed with power, influence, and a perfectly synchronized narrative. But Ava Harding knew that modern life left ghosts in the machine, digital breadcrumbs that even the most careful people couldn't erase. Their task was to find them. The work was a soul-crushing grind. The Georgia Peach Inn, being a cash-and-carry establishment, had no security cameras. But the area around it was a patchwork of urban sprawl. Gas stations, convenience stores, warehouses, and small businesses, each with its own cheap, often unreliable CCTV system. Ava and Ben spent the next 3 days collecting footage, a tedious process of formal requests, polite cajoling, and sometimes outright pleading. They ended up with over 200 hours of grainy, low-resolution video from a dozen different sources, all covering the 12-hour window in which Silas Vance had died. They set up shop in a small, windowless viewing room at the precinct, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and microwave popcorn. The work was hypnotically boring. They watched endless loops of cars passing, pedestrians hurrying by, the mundane ballet of city life. "This is hopeless," Ben said on the second day, rubbing his eyes. He was staring at a screen showing the entrance to a 24-hour laundromat. "We're looking for one specific car in a sea of thousands. We don't even know what we're looking for." "We're looking for something that doesn't belong," Ava said, her own eyes glued to a different monitor, showing a gas station's foggy camera. "A high-end car in a low-end neighborhood in the middle of the night. It'll stand out." They fast-forwarded through hours of footage, their eyes trained to spot anomalies. They saw delivery trucks, beat-up sedans, and the occasional police cruiser. Nothing. Ben was beginning to lose faith, his clicking becoming more listless. It was late on the third day when Ava saw it. On the screen from a convenience store camera, located a quarter mile from the motel, she saw a car turn down a side street, the street that led directly behind the Georgia Peach Inn. It was just a glimpse, a 3-second flash of headlights and a dark silhouette. But the car's profile was sleek, low, and expensive. It was a luxury sedan. "Ben, rewind that," she commanded, her voice sharp with sudden focus. He rewound the footage. They watched it again. And again. The car was dark, probably black or charcoal gray. It was impossible to make out the license plate. The angle was wrong, and the resolution was terrible. "It's something," Ben said, a spark of energy returning. "But it's not enough. It could be anyone." "Let's track it," Ava said. They began pulling up the feeds from other cameras in the area, trying to follow the car's path. They lost it for 2 blocks, then picked it up again on a camera from a warehouse loading dock. This time, the car was coming out of the same side street, about 25 minutes after it had entered. It was moving faster now, more purposefully, still no license plate. But this camera, slightly better than the first, caught a fleeting detail, the distinctive star-like pattern of the alloy wheels. "That's a specific rim package," Ben said, leaning close to the screen. He was a bit of a car enthusiast. "High-end. I think it's a Lexus. A late-model LS, maybe. A Lexus LS, a car favored by executives, lawyers, and judges." The final piece came from the most unlikely of sources, a red-light camera at an intersection a mile away from the motel. It had been triggered by a speeding pickup truck, but in the background of the high-resolution flash photo, another car was visible, waiting at the light. It was a dark gray Lexus LS. The flash illuminated the side of the car, and for a single, perfect frame, the camera captured the unique, star-patterned wheels. It still wasn't enough to get a plate number, but it was a clear, undeniable image of the vehicle. Ava felt a cold thrill of victory. She pulled up the file they had on Judge Thorne. In his financial disclosures, he listed his assets. Among them was a vehicle, a 2-year-old charcoal gray Lexus LS 500. Ben let out a low whistle. The alibi is dead. The fortress hadn't just been breached. They had found a secret tunnel leading straight into the king's chamber. Judge Thorne hadn't been at the art gallery discussing charity events. He had been in his luxury sedan, parked in the shadows behind a rundown motel, his world about to come crashing down. "He lied to us," Ben said, his voice laced with a newfound anger. "A federal judge lied to homicide detectives." "People lie to protect themselves," Ava said, her gaze fixed on the image of the car. Now we get to find out exactly what he was protecting. She stood up, her back aching from days spent in the chair. Get a warrant for the car's GPS data and the judge's cell phone records. The polite questions are over. Armed with the image of the Lexus and the unwavering certainty it provided, they didn't go to Judge Thorne. Not yet. They went for the weaker link. They went for Julian Croft. They found him at the gallery supervising the installation of a new, sprawling sculpture. When he saw them, his polite smile was brittle, a thin veneer over a core of anxiety. He led them to his office, the same glass cube of curated perfection, but this time the atmosphere was thick with tension. "Detectives," he began, attempting to take control. "I've already told you everything I know. Marcus was with me that night. My staff can attest to it." Ava didn't sit down. She remained standing, a silent, imposing figure. She placed a single glossy photograph on the polished surface of his desk. It was the image from the red light camera, showing the charcoal gray Lexus LS, its distinctive wheels gleaming in the flash. Julian Croft stared at the photograph. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. He looked from the photo to Ava's unyielding expression, and in that moment, he knew the charade was over. The fortress had crumbled. "We know he was there, Julian," Ava said, her voice quiet but firm. She used his first name deliberately, stripping away the formal barrier between them. "The alibi you provided was a lie. We have a warrant for the car's GPS data on its way. It will place his vehicle behind that motel on the night Silas Vance died. Lying to federal investigators in a homicide case is a serious felony. It's time to stop protecting him and start protecting yourself." Julian sank into his expensive leather chair, the fight draining out of him. He stared at the photo as if it were a venomous snake. For a full minute, he said nothing. The only sound in the office, the faint hum of the gallery's climate control. The sophisticated art dealer, the man of influence and taste, vanished. In his place was a man cornered and terrified. "You don't understand," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. He wouldn't look at them, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wood on his desk. "You don't know what that creature was doing to him." "Then tell us," Ben urged, his tone softer now, sensing the break. Julian took a shaky breath. This was the moment of truth, the moment he had to choose a new lie to replace the old one. He began to speak, his words carefully chosen, constructing a new, more plausible narrative designed to shield Marcus from the worst of the fallout. "Marcus was being blackmailed," he said. "That scum Vance found out about our relationship." He glanced up at them, a flash of defiance in his eyes. "He found out that Marcus is gay and that we have been partners for over 15 years. He threatened to go to the press, to destroy his career, his life, everything he has worked for. He told them how the pressure had been building for months, how Vance had become more and more demanding. He painted a picture of Marcus as a man on the edge, tormented and afraid. That night," Julian continued, his voice gaining a bit of its strength back, "Marcus decided he couldn't take it anymore. He was going to meet Vance, pay him one last time, and beg him to stop. He went to that disgusting motel to end it." "And you followed him," Ava stated. It wasn't a question. Julian nodded. "I was worried sick. I knew how volatile Marcus was feeling. I followed him, but I stayed in my car a block away. I just waited. He was in there for maybe 20 minutes. When he came out, he was pale, shaking. Here came the new lie, the one designed to save the man he loved. He got back in his car and drove to me. He said when he got there, Vance was already high. They argued. Vance got more and more agitated, demanding more money. And then he just collapsed. He'd taken too much. It was an accident, a horrible, tragic accident." Julian looked up, his eyes pleading. Marcus panicked. He's a judge. Being found in a motel room with a dead addict and a blackmailer, it would have been the end, regardless of the truth. I told him to drive away. I told him to come to the gallery and we would figure it out. I told him to say he was with me. I helped him. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake born of fear. But he didn't kill him. It was an accident. It was a brilliant pivot. Julian had sacrificed himself, admitting to obstruction of justice and fabricating an alibi, but in doing so, he had transformed a potential murder into an accidental death, coupled with a panicked cover-up. He was offering them a neat, tidy conclusion that would still ruin the judge's career, but might save him from a murder charge. Ava listened to the whole story without interruption. She knew it was still a lie, a more sophisticated one, but a lie nonetheless. An addict doesn't just collapse on cue, but Julian had given them the one thing they needed. He had placed Marcus Thorne in that room. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Croft," Ava said, her voice betraying no emotion. "You'll need to come with us to give a formal statement, and you should call a lawyer." As they escorted a now subdued Julian Croft out of his gallery, past the priceless art and the hushed staff, Ava knew the endgame was near. Julian had cracked the wall. Now it was time to bring the whole fortress down. The arrest of Julian Croft sent shockwaves through the city's elite circles, but the APD kept it quiet, holding him on charges of obstructing a federal investigation. The real target was still to come. With Croft's statement, a carefully constructed lie, but a statement nonetheless, they finally had enough probable cause to bring in Judge Marcus Thorne. They didn't arrest him at the courthouse. Ava insisted on a degree of professional courtesy. A quiet phone call from her captain to the judge's attorney. A meeting was arranged. It wasn't a request. The interrogation room was a stark contrast to Thorne's chambers. It was small, painted a dispassionate beige, with a single metal table and 3 chairs. The air was sterile. When Judge Thorne walked in, flanked by his high-powered lawyer, he looked diminished, stripped of the props of his power, the robe, the gavel, the imposing desk. He was just a man in an expensive suit, his face a tight mask of control. Ava and Ben sat opposite him. The usual pre-interrogation pleasantries were dispensed with. "We have a statement from Julian Croft," Ava began, her voice even. She laid a folder on the table between them, but didn't open it. "He's confessed to fabricating your alibi for the night of June 14th. He states that you were, in fact, at the Georgia Peach Inn with Silas Vance." Thorne's lawyer, a man named Arthur Jennings, immediately spoke up. "My client is here voluntarily, Detective. We are prepared to state that Judge Thorne was the victim of a vicious blackmail scheme. He made a regrettable error in judgment by meeting with Mr. Vance and a further error by not reporting the man's accidental death due to the extreme duress he was under." They were sticking to Julian's story. It was their last line of defense. Ava ignored the lawyer and kept her eyes locked on Thorne. "Is that how you remember it, Judge? An accident?" Thorne met her gaze, his own eyes like chips of ice. "Silas Vance was a parasite who preyed on the vulnerable. His choices led to his death. I was there. I panicked. It was the greatest mistake of my life." His voice was steady, rehearsed. He was still performing, playing the role of the flawed but honorable man who made a mistake under pressure. "Let's talk about your car, Judge," Ben interjected, sliding the photo of the Lexus across the table. "Its GPS data shows you parked in the alley behind the motel for exactly 22 minutes. Then it shows you driving to a location a block away and idling for another 7 minutes. That's where Julian Croft says you met him. Is that correct?" Thorne nodded stiffly. "It is." "So you left the scene, met with Mr. Croft, and then concocted an alibi," Ava continued, her voice relentless. "An alibi that held for over a week, until we found evidence you couldn't control." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "The thing about Mr. Croft's story, Judge, it's good. It's very good. It almost makes sense. But there's a problem. The medical examiner's initial report. He noted the needle mark on Vance's arm was at an angle inconsistent with self-injection. He said it looked like someone else administered the dose, someone with a very steady hand. The mask on Thorne's face began to show the faintest of cracks. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "That's conjecture," his lawyer snapped. "It can't be proven." "Maybe," Ava conceded, "but let's talk about something else. Let's talk about rage." She slid another evidence bag across the table. Inside were the 3 Sherman's black cigarette butts. "We found these in the alley where you parked. 2 of them were put out calmly. The last one," she tapped the bag. "The last one was ground into the dirt. That's not the action of a man going to calmly pay off a blackmailer. That's the action of a man at his breaking point." She saw it then. The memory flashed in his eyes. The memory of standing in that dark alley, the fury and fear churning in his gut, grinding that last cigarette out under his heel before marching into that motel room. "You went in there to end it, didn't you, Marcus?" Ava's voice was soft now, almost gentle. Not just the blackmail, all of it. The pressure of the trial, the fear of being exposed, the years of living a double life. Silas Vance was just the final straw. He was the focus of all that rage. Thorne's composure, the iron control he had maintained his entire adult life, finally shattered. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists on the table. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off. "You have no idea," he whispered, his voice cracking, the sound raw and broken. "You have no idea what it's like to build a life, piece by piece, to become a symbol for your community, and have it all threatened by a grubby little worm like him. To have the one pure thing in your life, your love for someone, turned into a weapon against you." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. The judge was gone. All that was left was the man. "It wasn't an accident," he said, the words barely audible. His lawyer paled, trying to interrupt, but Thorne waved him into silence. He looked directly at Ava Harding, a silent plea for understanding in his gaze. "Tell me what happened, Marcus," Ava said softly. "Tell me the truth." And in the sterile quiet of that interrogation room, the truth, in all its ugly, tragic detail, finally began to spill out. The story Judge Marcus Thorne told was not one of cold, premeditated murder. It was a story of a slow, simmering pressure that had finally, catastrophically, exploded. As he spoke, the interrogation room seemed to fade away, replaced by the grimy, claustrophobic walls of Room 7 at the Georgia Peach Inn. "I went there to pay him," Thorne began, his voice a monotone, as if he were observing a memory from a great distance. "That was the plan. Julian had given me the cash, $10,000. I was going to give it to him and tell him it was the last time. I was going to plead with him." He described walking from his car, the taste of the last angry cigarette still in his mouth. He knocked on the door of Room 7. Silas Vance opened it, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face. The room smelled of sweat and something sickly sweet. "He was high," Thorne said. Not incapacitated, but his eyes had that glittery, restless look. It made him bold, arrogant. Vance let him in and immediately saw the thick envelope of cash in Thorne's hand. He snatched it, riffled through it, and then laughed. "This is a good start, Judge," Thorne recounted Vance's words. "A nice down payment, but the price of my silence is going up. A man in your position, especially right now with this big trial, your reputation must be worth at least 6 figures, don't you think?" The demand, the sheer audacity of it, struck Thorne like a physical blow. The plan to plead, to reason with him, evaporated in a hot flash of rage. "I told him no," Thorne said. "I told him it was over. I was going to go to Julian, and we were going to go to the authorities. Consequences be damned. I was done being his victim." That's when the situation escalated. Vance's smugness turned to panicked fury. He blocked the door, his demeanor changing from a cunning predator to a cornered rat. "You're not going anywhere," Vance had screamed. "You think you can just walk away? I own you, you hear me? I'll call every news station in this city. Federal judge's secret gay life with art dealer boyfriend. How's that for a headline during your big important trial?" Vance, in his agitated state, grabbed the syringe from the nightstand. It was already loaded with his next fix. He waved it menacingly. It was a pathetic, desperate gesture, but in that moment, it was a weapon. "You're going to ruin my life?" Vance had sneered. "I'll ruin yours first." "I just..." "Snapped," Thorne whispered, his gaze distant. "All the years of hiding, of carefully building my career, of carrying the weight of my community's expectations. And this pathetic little man was threatening to burn it all down with my own truth. I lunged at him. I didn't even think." The struggle was short and ugly. Thorne, taller and stronger, easily overpowered Vance. He slammed him against the wall, the syringe clattering to the floor. Vance fought back, scratching and kicking, but it was futile. Thorne pinned him to the bed, one hand clamped over his mouth, the other pressing his shoulder down. Vance's eyes were wide with terror. The predator had become the prey. "He was still struggling," Thorne continued, his voice barely a whisper. "I just wanted him to be quiet. I saw the syringe on the floor. I picked it up." In that moment, a dark, cold clarity descended upon him. It wasn't a plan, it was an impulse, a terrible final solution to a problem that had tormented him for months. I grabbed his arm. He tried to pull away, but I held him fast. I put the needle to his skin. He paused, swallowing hard. The memory was vivid, tactile. The feel of the man's wiry muscle under his hand, the slight resistance of the skin as the needle went in. He looked at me. His eyes, he knew. In that last second, he knew it wasn't a threat anymore. I pushed the plunger. I pushed it all the way down. Thorne released him. Vance's body went limp, his eyes rolling back. A soft sigh escaped his lips, and then nothing. The struggle was over. The yelling was over. The threats were over. There was only the profound, suffocating silence Ava had sensed from the very beginning. I stood there for a long time, Thorne concluded, his voice breaking completely, looking at what I had done. The man I was supposed to be, the symbol of justice, had just killed a man in a filthy motel room. I wiped my fingerprints from the syringe, placed it on the nightstand. I made it look right. Then I walked out. I didn't look back. He finally fell silent. The full, ugly truth hung in the air of the interrogation room, brutal and undeniable. His lawyer sat with his head in his hands. Ava Harding looked at the broken man in front of her. She felt no triumph, only a deep, hollowing sadness. This was the end of the road. Justice, in its most painful and complicated form, had arrived. She nodded to Ben. He stood up, walked around the table, and in the quiet of the room, the sharp metallic click of the handcuffs closing around Judge Marcus Thorne's wrists sounded as final as a gavel strike. The fall of Judge Marcus Thorne was as swift as it was spectacular. The news broke like a dam, flooding the city with a torrent of shock, speculation, and outrage. The story had everything: a respected federal judge, a secret gay relationship, blackmail, a racially charged trial thrown into chaos, and a sordid death in a cheap motel. It was a media firestorm. Supporters of the judge cried foul, claiming it was a conspiracy, a targeted takedown of a powerful black man. Detractors painted him as a hypocrite and a monster, a man who preached justice from the bench while committing the ultimate injustice in the shadows. The truth, as Ava Harding knew, was far more complicated and tragic than any headline could capture. Julian Croft, sticking to his story to the bitter end to minimize his own role, was convicted of obstruction of justice and being an accessory after the fact. He received a 5-year sentence, his curated world of art and influence replaced by the brutalist architecture of a state prison. Marcus Thorne, facing the undeniable evidence in his own confession, pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. The charge acknowledged the lack of premeditation, but recognized the intent to kill in a moment of passion and rage. He was sentenced to 15 years. The image of him being led from the courtroom in a prison jumpsuit, his face etched with a grief too deep for tears, became the final, damning photograph of his public life. Months later, as the autumn chill began to settle over Atlanta, Ava Harding sat on the porch of her small house, a cup of tea warming her hands. She was officially on leave, counting down the final weeks to her retirement. The Thorne case had been her last. It had taken a piece of her, as the big ones always did. She didn't feel a sense of victory. She felt a profound melancholy. The case wasn't a simple story of good versus evil. It was a tragedy with no true villains, only broken people making desperate choices. Silas Vance was a predator, yes, but his own life was a product of neglect and desperation. Julian Croft acted out of a fierce, misguided love, building a fortress of lies that ultimately trapped the person he was trying to protect. And Marcus Thorne. Ava sighed. His was the deepest tragedy of all. He had spent his entire life building an impeccable facade, becoming the man everyone needed him to be, a beacon for his community, a pillar of the law, a symbol of integrity. He had achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of, except for the one thing that mattered most: the freedom to be himself. The price of his silence, the cost of his fear of what society would do to a powerful black gay man, was immeasurable. That fear had made him vulnerable to a man like Vance. That fear had twisted his love for Julian into a dangerous secret. And that fear, in one final explosive moment in a motel room, had turned him into a killer. It had destroyed not just his own life, but the lives of 2 other men as well. The real crime, Ava thought, hadn't happened in room 7. The real crime was the societal pressure, the silent, pervasive judgment that forced a man like Marcus Thorne to believe that his truth was a liability, that his identity was something to be hidden away in the dark. If he had felt safe enough to live openly, would any of this have happened? Perhaps not. Vance would have had no weapon. Thorne would have had no secret to kill for. A car pulled up in her driveway. It was Ben Carter. He got out, holding a small potted orchid. A retirement gift. "Thought your garden could use something new?" he said, handing it to her. "Thank you, Ben," she said, a genuine smile touching her lips. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the city. "You know," Ben said finally, "I learned a lot from you on that case." "What's that?" Ava asked. "That sometimes the most important clue isn't what you find at the crime scene," he replied. "It's understanding why the crime scene exists in the first place." Ava nodded, looking at the distant skyline. The world wouldn't change overnight. There would always be secrets, and there would always be fear. But as she looked at the young, thoughtful detective beside her, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the next generation would learn to build fewer walls and more bridges. And in doing so, they might prevent the next person from having to pay the terrible, lonely price of silence.